Da-da. Yes, and you have yours. We are safe. The theme of the whole conference is, of course, keeping it simple. And when I was asked to give this keynote address, obviously I was asked, please speak to the theme, keeping it simple. I can't do that. If you want to back out now and throw me off the podium, Costa, this is your last opportunity. But I'm afraid it isn't actually going to be entirely simple. Part of the reason for that is something that more and more interests and fascinates me about the technique is not just how simple it is, but how extraordinarily profound it is in its ability to affect us at very, very deep levels. If you really practice it, if you really put it into practice, it becomes an embodiment practice. And what we're going to look at a little bit is just what that might mean. So, a curious thing happened, just while I reach for the water, a curious thing happened as I started to ponder this. A whole raft of key words drifted into my mind, all beginning with the letter A. So tonight's keynote address is brought to you courtesy of the letter A, sponsored by the letter A, you might say. What kind of words? Well, Alexander, obviously. Awareness, obviously. Adaptability, a very important human quality. Automatic, as in the technical term automatic postural responses. Attitude, a word I love that we'll get to. Analog, another favorite Alexander-related word of mine. Aspiration, a word which I think has great resonance when we talk about direction. Antagonistic, as in antagonistic pulls. Acceptance, as in learning to live with antagonistic qualities. Art, as in arts and sciences and arts and crafts. So we're going to use those key words as little markers as we go on through this. I think we can take for granted the word Alexander and the word awareness. So let's go on to automatic, as in automatic postural responses. And I'll warn you that this bit is a little bit scientific. It gets less so as we go along. But in the latest issue of AMSAT News, you'll find some articles, I wrote one of them myself, which talk around this question of, are we dealing with reflexes built into us, there from birth, pristine, perfect, in all of us as children, which we somehow, with our lazy and probably immoral behavior, have really screwed up. And notice in FM's literature, he has a liking for words like debauched and perverted. There are some moral overtones there. So we've gotten ourselves into this shocking situation where we've drifted away from that initial perfection. And how many thousands, dare we say tens of thousands, dare we say more, dollars, and how many hundreds of thousands of hours have we all had to put in to somehow eradicating those evil habits and getting back to the original perfection? Now this is in the nature of what, without being pejorative, I'm going to call a myth. Now, that sounds like a pejorative, a myth, it's a stupid, it's a lie. early on, my first visit to America, I was teaching at Michael Frederick's invitation in Ojai, California, at a residential. And I was giving a talk to the people who'd signed on for this. And I was giving what I thought was a simple anatomical explanation of the technique. And a man came up to me afterwards who turned out to be something scientific or medical. And he said to me, "That was a lovely myth." I was a little miffed about this. I was a little upset. "Myth?" I said. "I'm telling you the facts." "Oh, come on," he said. "I'm not trying to put you down. Every profession, every practice has its stories that we tell ourselves to explain ourselves to ourselves. And of course to explain ourselves also to others. But in particular, our myths are the stories we tell ourselves to explain ourselves to ourselves. The myth of the perfect child has an unfortunate side effect. I think I've noticed in myself over decades, and I've discovered more and more recently in conversations with other teachers, there's like a little inner shadow side to this. We never seem to get there. We never seem to get back to this perfection. These evil habits never seem to go away. What's wrong with us? Are we just pathetically weak compared to FM himself? I think that if you talk to people very privately, perhaps, I think you will find that there is, in many of us, has been, can be, these little traces of inner concern, guilt, even a little touch of shame. I've been an Alexander teacher all these decades. I still got these habits. What's gone wrong? I still haven't recovered. Effortless, 100%, 24/7 perfect use. Well, I've also talked to yoga teachers, and surprise, surprise, they have the same problem. There's this little inner secret of the fact that, they're up there as paragons of their art, paragons of their practice, and yet inside they don't feel quite up to it. So I think it might be helpful to us sometime to reconsider the reflex model, the concomitant perfect child model, because science is really tremendously coming to our aid in this respect, in two vital aspects. The concept of automatic postural responses, as opposed to reflexes, allows for ongoing, constant, continuous learning. When I first encountered the phrase automatic postural responses, I had a reaction that many of you probably have. Oh gee, it's a synonym for reflexes. Why do these scientists think that by changing the vocabulary, they can kid us into thinking they're talking about something else? It's all the same thing. Actually, I don't think it is. It really does give a much more open-ended model in which our nervous system, even from the first few months of life, the first few weeks of life, is continually learning, even at the level of what and how to, let me rephrase that, how and how much muscle tone needs to be distributed throughout the body for whatever actions we wish to perform. It's clear that this is very much something that we're dealing with at a physical level in Alexander work. And if we take on this idea that, yes, we're all born with the neurological capacity of continually modulating, moderating, adapting muscle tone, not only in response to the actions we make, but in advance. What Dr. Tristram Roberts in England, a great fan of the Alexander technique, called preemptive activity. We don't just respond, we already predict when I reach for that glass of water, my arm going forward, the weight of it will drag me forward. The musculature in the back of my calves, quite below my level of consciousness, gets a little extra tone because I'm considering reaching for the glass of water. That's much more sophisticated as a model, but it also has this advantage that it's an open-ended learning model. And as we go along, excuse me, has a little leaf of some sort. And it went straight into my mouth. Maybe I'll just have to take another sip to clear that. So, an open-ended learning model. And as we're continually learning, that even as infants, we're building up that thing that FM called a sensory register, a kinesthesia, a sensory appreciation. And the modern jargon now in neuroscience for this is that it's either called a body schema or simply our internal representation. But again, it's well accepted now among the scientists studying these things that is continually evolving and adapting. And one of the nice, attractive things, I think, from our point of view, about an open-ended, future-oriented learning model is that those of us who learned rather badly first time around, hey, you get a second chance and a third chance and a fourth chance and a fifth chance. You can go on relearning, being re-educated, and you can learn better and better and better. So I think, that's a helpful aspect to bear in mind if in the darkness of late night when you're lying in bed waiting to go to sleep, you have these awful whirling thoughts about what a bad person you are because, today was one of those days when those bad habits came back. And God, I've been in this work for how many years? The other way in which science is coming to our aid is right there in this month's Scientific American. Has anybody bought it? Anybody know what's on the front cover? It's all about habits. The front cover story is about habits, how we develop them and so on. One of the key things that has emerged now from a lot of study of the neuroscience of habit is that actually FM was in a sense wrong with his seeming belief that the old habits will wither away and disappear. The scientific studies seem to show that the tracks in your brain never disappear. And the studies described in the Scientific American this month, now, admittedly, it ain't human beings. Of course, it's all about rats and mice, particularly rats. But who knows? Most of that stuff seems to have been the past, turned out to have a lot of relevance to us. And the fact is that a habit pattern that has been built up in a bunch of rats and then been superseded by teaching them another habit pattern, it only takes a very small change in one very small part of the neocortex, as it's called. And it says in the article, the old habits come back in seconds. That's a little terrifying. In seconds. It is part of our own experience and one that we need to recognize, that years and decades later, a certain stimulus that knocks you off guard, takes you by surprise. You're tired, you're stressed, your health isn't great. You can be taken back to those old habits in seconds. The moral of the story is, don't beat yourself up about it. You're not a bad person. Science is on our side. Now, let me just shuffle these papers. So, coming back to looking at a way of explaining ourselves to ourselves, a myth, if you like, that has a little more of a future-oriented, open-ended learning growth model about it. Reminded me that Walter Carrington said to me at one point, he thought that the way FM talked about his work, it sometimes seemed as if FM believed that we could consciously tap into the energy of growth that fuels our physical growth in the first 20 years or so of our life. Now that sounds a little wacky. The fact is that after your early 20s, you don't grow much anymore in that physical sense. But growth after the early 20s is going to have to be very much a growth in consciousness and a growth in skillfulness in living. There's a phrase of FM's that has come back to me recently that never really struck me when I first heard it. But it seems that he used to refer to directions as conscious guiding orders. Conscious guiding orders. Margaret Goldie used to like to use that phrase. FM also referred to conscious guidance and control. What I'm liking about it is that the word guidance comes first, not the word control. We're so accustomed to hearing constructive conscious control, conscious control, conscious control. Conscious guidance and control has a different nuance about it, a different shade about it. It's important to us also, I think, because, again, as science, philosophy, and our general cultural view of the world, view of life, the cultural models that emerge in our society, as they have evolved and changed since FM's time, I think that in FM's writing, the seeming opposition between reason and emotion has perhaps outlived its usefulness to some extent. It does seem more and more apparent that these two things are not actually, do not have to be seen in opposition to each other. Some of you may know that Antonio Damasio's neuroscience work suggests that if you actually really surgically or because of head injury separate in the brain the parts that seem to be most involved in reasoning from the parts that are most involved in emotion, feeling, the person suffering from this has an extraordinary difficulty in making any decisions. So if you actually were a purely rational creature, you might find that you don't actually get very far. You stand there endlessly debating with yourself the pros and cons of each choice that you might be able to make. But nothing happens to give that little extra weight to one side of the argument over another. Now, if we're consciously guiding our actions, our responses to the stimuli of life, how do we decide what choices to make, what decisions to make, what actions to perform instead of others, and how to perform them? Well, in one sense, that's a huge subject, and it relates to the fact that the technique is often seen or described as a tool, an instrument, a vehicle. That's a good analogy, a vehicle. But a vehicle that will take you anywhere you want to go. It's, in a sense, a value-free vehicle. Where do you want to go? How do you decide that? We build up in a lifetime our own set of values. We build up our values by the choices we make about the books we read, the people we choose to associate most with, as opposed to the people we choose not to associate with, the movies we choose to go to, all those influences we choose to expose ourselves to. That's how we build up our values. And it's on the basis of those that we make the decisions, the choices about how to respond and how to act. At a really simple physical level, because you and I, we've all chosen to make good use, in an Alexander sense, an important part of our value system. At simple physical response level, we can say, well, I make my decision on the basis of the fact that I want to act in such a way that I can still allow freedom of the neck, free poise of the head, decompression of the spine, optimal, natural, resilient length of the spine, widening and spreading through the back and sides so I'm fully able to breathe. Primary control. In FM's last book, Universal Constant, he actually describes primary control as a criterion for assessing your use, a criterion for assessing whether the action you performed with good use or not. Nice and simple at the physical level. Oh, I need to pick something up from the floor or from the shelf under there. Gee, I'd better do all that monkey thing. Keep my spine long and all that. Oh, I need to reach up to change a light bulb. Oh, I'd better not pull my head back and compress and pull my lower back forward. Easy peasy, as we used to say in London. But when you live this stuff, as you all know, and I asked earlier, by the way, to have the AC turn up a bit more. Can I chuck this over there? Thank you. Because I'm finding that it's making me a little too hot. We all know that the technique infiltrates our lives at a much deeper level than just how do I bend to pick something up off the floor? How do I reach up to change the light bulb? How does that happen? That's something that's always intrigued and puzzled me. And to get further into that, we are now going to dive into woo-woo land. Now, I'm sure that causes a reaction in many of you. In a certain percentage of you, there'll be a little tingle of excitement. In another percentage of you, there'll be an inner shudder. Oh my God, not that. The percentage will vary a little from East Coast to West Coast. But I'd better not say anything more about that. For those of you who had an inner shudder, fear not. Bear with it, Suspend disbelief, as the poet Wordsworth said, and all will be well, you'll discover. So just bear with it. In the Western esoteric tradition, some of you will know what that is, some of you won't. In the Western esoteric tradition, the oldest and most famous saying is, "As above, so below." Short, simple, snappy. Attributed to a supposed Egyptian priest-king, ancient Egyptian, called Hermes Trismegistus, I think it's pronounced. Actually, later scholarship says the texts attributed to him were probably written 1500 to 1800 years ago, which doesn't get it as far back as ancient Egypt, but still pretty old enough. The esoteric tradition also says that all knowledge is inscribed on an etheric record called the Akashic Records, Akashic Records. We sophisticates of the 21st century know very well that that is merely a primitive forerunner of Wikipedia. So I looked up the phrase "as above, so below" in Wikipedia. Here's what it tells us. Whatever happens on any level of reality, physical, emotional, or mental, also happens on every other level. That's a pretty powerful statement. Not bad, these ancients, really. They had something. So here's where one of my long-time favorite A words comes in, and that's the word analog. When I did a book with Sean Carey in about 1900, I wrote that I thought... Sorry, 1990. Taking that word ancient a little too seriously there. Oh, that's an A word. Oh, God. That's another ancient. Yeah, we won't go down that track. I wrote that I considered primary control to be a physical level analog of things also happening at other levels. An analog is an expression in one form of forces or processes that also happen in other forms at different levels. The analog watch, I'm wearing one, its movement is an analog of the movement or flow of time. Some of this is embedded in our language. We actually have such physical expressions that have meanings at other levels. Uprightness. Uprightness has very strong, what should we say, moral, behavioral connotations. Poise and balance are words or concepts that operate at every level, from the most physical to the most metaphysical. I'm waving my hand around, and you could say I can reach out and I can grasp the glass of water. But we also talk about, I can't quite grasp it. What's this guy talking about? I don't quite grasp what he's saying. A mental concept. For those of you, I said some of you would have that little inner shudder when we went off into the Western esoteric tradition, and the, what was it called? The Akashic Records and all that stuff. Now, have a look at this. This is a very fine book by a man called Sean Gallagher. And I was lucky enough to meet him a couple of years ago at the first Embodied Cognition and Alexander conference in Paris. And Sean is a philosopher specializing in the area, I think he actually is considered one of the founders of an area called neurophenomenology. That's a mouthful. Neurophenomenology. Phenomenology is a branch of philosophy that goes back to Edmund Husserl in 19th century Germany. And it was a way of a branch of philosophy that actually attempted to really, as carefully and dispassionately as possible, reflect on and describe your own, our own subjective experience. It really was a philosophy of the subjective self-study of consciousness. It fell out of favor somewhat with the rise of neuroscience. But actually, people are now putting the two together. And Sean is one of the great pioneers of philosophizing in such a way that with a deep knowledge of current neuroscience, he can write and talk about how consciousness is embodied. And the book is actually called How the Body Shapes the Mind. So if as above, so below, and all that stuff gave you the shudders, let's read a little bit of Sean Gallagher. Movement and the registration of that movement in a developing proprioceptive system, that is a system that registers its own self-movement, contributes to the self-organizing development of neuronal structures responsible not only for motor action, but for the way we come to be conscious of ourselves, the way we communicate with others, and the way we live in the surrounding world. Across the Cartesian divide, movement prefigures the lines of intentionality. Gesture formulates the contours of social cognition, and in both the most general and the most specific ways, embodiment shapes the mind. That's also a pretty powerful statement. From as above, so below, and its Wikipedia expansion, where was that? I've lost it now, to Sean Gallagher. They're kind of talking about the same thing. It's actually not woo-woo at all. At the level of the relationship between reason and emotion, here's Sean Gallagher again. He says, Damasio, emphasizing the effect of emotion on experience, discusses muscular visceral endocrine. 3 words put together with hyphens between them. Muscular visceral endocrine adjustments that are non-conscious but nonetheless shape our conscious experience. Then he quotes Varela and Depraz. Now Varela was actually a man called Francisco Varela. Varela was the inspiration of much of the modern embodied mind, embodied cognition, neurophenomenological type studies. He passed away a few years ago. He was living in Paris, and he helped found the Cognitive Science Institute, where this conference was held, introducing Alexander Teachers and neuroscience, neurophenomenology philosophers to each other. Varela and a colleague called Depraz, following the emphasis in Husserl's later work, reiterate the inseparability of lived body, affect, and cognition. Lived body, affect, and cognition. All of this, I think, is pointing us towards, again, a model of much more open-ended, future-oriented learning and growth, and a model in which embodiment is a fundamental factor. And with embodiment comes this wonderful word, attitude. Now, before I get to that, let me just say one more thing about embodied mind, embodied cognition. It really is the growing trend, the cutting edge of that part of neuroscience and philosophy that's studying mind and consciousness. And I really think we could actually say we are the embodied mindfulness practice. That is what we do. We are the practice of embodied mind, embodied aspiration. There's another word we'll get to. And embodied consciousness. And it might be very helpful to us to try to build better links with the burgeoning, growing interest in mindfulness practices throughout the US and I believe in other Western countries as well. If we get to this word attitude, gosh, have I gone on so long? Are you still awake? You all right there? All okay? All right. Gosh. I'll speed up a little, speak faster. I think we've got to rescue this attitude word. You know how it's turned into something that means bad attitude? Oh, so-and-so's got an attitude. That automatically means a bad attitude. But we really need to rescue it. We really need to celebrate the immense potential of this word, because it's a word that covers everything from physical posture through every level. Physical posture, psychological, emotional, mental, what people would even call spiritual attitude. Fabulous word. So what are we doing when we make the choice to stop closing down on ourselves, pulling down? When we make the choice to stop doing that, and we choose to rechannel our energies into a freer, more expansive postural attitude. If the body can shape the mind, and if as above, so below, and therefore as below, so above, hey, there's an awful lot of potential in this. If we're willing to let this influence all aspects of our lives, I think we're aspiring, and that's another important A word. We're actually aspiring to embody that attitude at all levels. As I said, we are the practice of embodied mindfulness or embodied aspiration. We're consciously aspiring to go up. That's what Alexander called it, going up. But in such a way that we don't do it in the normal sense of that word. And you could reinterpret that to say, we don't do it in a willful, egotistical way. We guide and channel our energies. What we're aiming at, perhaps, is to tap into an energy that is stimulated by the universal force of gravity as we accept and welcome our contact with the ground. And this is an embodied aspiration towards continued growth. If you add to that the widening that FM spoke of as a freeing of the thorax, you actually get an open-heartedness mixed in with this. These are not just metaphors. If there really is a way in which the body shapes the mind, if this analog process actually works, these are more than just metaphors. And what's more, you actually can't fake it. That's pretty impressive. Have you all heard the term high status posture? Google it. I won't go into it now, but there have been various popular articles about how valuable it is to have high status posture. And that people who have high status posture, they gain more deference from other people. Immediately, other people relate to them differently and probably more deferentially. Feels good, doesn't it? Yeah. Well, maybe for a while. But you know, all it's really doing is you're just kind of armoring yourself even more. And you know what that kind of does is it, in the end, you're even more isolated inside there. And I think one of the marvelous things about this process is that rechanneling your energies from kind of closing down and in on yourself to that, it actually does kind of slowly turn you inside out. And that's not just a metaphor either, surprisingly. Along with the phrase, as above, so below, I bet some of you have heard the phrase, making the inner and the outer as one. That's a powerful phrase. Powerful phrases have an almost physical resonance in your body. Great poetry does. This constant turning yourself inside out actually, I think, slowly makes you a little more porous, a little more transparent. It actually does thin the walls, the barriers between inside and outside. Allows you to become more, what can we say? A point of view within a larger picture. Part of a larger process, a network. Nexus, there's a popular word. Even Google has appropriated it for its smartphone. To help ground this, which has gotten a little far out, in something you deal with practically as Alexander teaches, I was working with a teacher this morning, helping her with her hands-on skills, and she was putting a hand on the back of my head, the back of my neck. And I said to her, because the problem is, the hand can get grippy, it kind of grips too much, or it gets pushes into you, or it drifts too much. I said, think of your hand as just being an invitation to my neck and head to come back and up into your hand. That's an attitude. That's what it is. And there was an instant, dramatic, and very, very beneficial change in the quality of her hand and its effect on me. It really was as if her entire nervous system was issuing an invitation to my entire nervous system. That's an attitude. And she was embodying it. And she could choose it. Another experiment you can try for yourselves sometimes that I rather like is a little change in the way you think about neck free, head forward and up. A little nuance. Rather than thinking of it as I'm pointing in that direction, which is fine. That's a very valuable, important, often necessary and helpful way to think of it. But experiment a little bit sometimes with thinking, I'm not just pointing, I'm taking the lid off. It's kind of like I put a lid on this area. I'm releasing up through here to let the top and the back of my head be open and more receptive to whatever is there. It has an interesting effect if you want to try that. Again, it's an attitude. So, I won't keep you much longer. You're still all there? Yes? Okay. A lot of what I've talked about is stuff I've mulled over for a very, very long time. But a little extra bit came to me recently. And that is that most of the big issues in life seem to revolve around polarities. This opposed to that. For example, self-control versus self-expression. That's an interesting polarity. It's an especially interesting polarity for the Alexander technique. Isn't it curious that FM wrote, "My technique is nothing if it is not a technique for the control of human reaction"? Yet what's the biggest audience for the technique? Who are its biggest fans? Where has it made the greatest inroads? Performing arts, quintessentially self-expression. Other polarities you could consider, well, the arts and the scientists. Self-esteem versus self-sacrifice, both very worthwhile values. At a really extreme level, free will versus determinism. For those of you who did get the Scientific American, skip to near the end. There's a whole article on how society may need to adapt its social, legal, and political institutions to the realization that maybe there's no such thing as free will. There's a disturbing polarity for you, and when you're in the business we're in. But when I was in my 20s, this kind of thing deeply disturbed me. It gave rise, some of you may resonate with this, gave rise to desperate searching for the answers. That there had to be one or the other. It can't be both. This also gave rise to what I would describe as head-banging frustration. And slowly over the years, I get less and less worried about that. Now, generally, until very recently, I've said to myself, oh, you get less bothered about things like that as you get older. Frankly, it's probably just the creeping weariness of age. But I'm actually starting to rethink that. I'm starting to rethink it because it's not just that I find these dichotomies and polarities don't seem so pressing anymore. It's not just that the energy I put into it all is fading. It's actually, they're kind of enjoyable. Instead of being problems that have to be solved, as somebody once wrote, they become mysteries to be lived. And it's actually very creative and enjoyable to be able more and more to live with paradoxes. Now here's where analogues come in again, an Alexander direction. This may seem even more far out, but I've been toying with the idea that if you spend many decades practicing FM's antagonistic pulls, what do you learn from that? One of the things you learn from it is that having things that seem polar opposites, that seem to take you in different directions, actually supplies you with a very enjoyable, powerful experience of elastic expansion. And at a physical level, that's enjoyable, it's fun, it helps you to move and breathe better, it's kind of creative. But if, here we go again, how the body shapes the mind has something going for it, isn't it possible that that stretches you at other levels and actually makes it easier and more enjoyable to realize that those polar opposites are, in their own way, giving you creative, elastic expansion at all levels? So, the A words have almost come to an end. I've almost exhausted them. Whose iPhone was that? We know it's got to be an iPhone. They're the ones that have that sound. Shame on you. I said that some of those powerful phrases resonate almost physically with you. One that I'm very fond of goes like this. Man is a child of earth and of the starry heavens. That's from the poet Robert Graves. Man is a child of earth and of the starry heavens. It's Robert Graves' translation of something that was apparently written over the entrance to the temple of the Oracle of Delphi in ancient Greece. But I think it's just rather beautiful in expressing something about what I'm saying we are trying to embody. There is something about being really present on the ground, accepting of the fragile physicality of our situation, the physical beingness of us, which is both very, very stubborn and yet eventually very, very fragile. Accepting that and yet reaching beyond ourselves, connecting to something more than ourselves. And I think viewing the technique in this way brings us to the last A word, which is that it's kind of an adventure when you look at it like that. So with that in mind, and asking yourselves, what attitudes and values are you personally aiming to embody when you direct with conscious guidance and control? I thank you for your patience and your attention. I'll leave it there. Thank you.